The war didn't start with the sound of bombs. It started with the sound of rain. Relentless, cold, uncaring rain that fell on men who had nowhere to hide. In 1941, long before the United States fully understood the scale of the storm it was walking into, soldiers and sailors were already scattered across outposts from the Aleutian Islands to the Solomon Chain, from the Sahara's burning sand to the dark jungles of Bataan. The enemy was still distant in many of these places, but another enemy had already arrived. Exposure. The cold cut deeper than shrapnel. The damp crawled into bones and lungs. The Pacific air turned tense into soggy rags, and the Arctic wind tore canvas like paper. The young men sent to fight were learning that courage was not enough. A man who couldn't stay dry couldn't fight. A man who couldn't rest couldn't think. Armies didn't just need bullets. They needed shelter. The American command discovered this truth the hard way. Reports began to pile up on desks in Washington. Pneumonia cases, frostbite, malnutrition, fevers, men sleeping in mud. At first, the generals shrugged it off. Soldiers have slept rough since the beginning of time, they said. But then the casualty charts began to show something that frightened even the most hardened officers. More men were being lost to sickness and exhaustion than to enemy fire. The human body was breaking before the battle even began. The message was clear. America didn't just have to build weapons. It had to build a roof strong enough to hold up a global army. Back home, far from the front lines, the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks began to think differently. A handful of architects and engineers were called into a meeting room at a naval base in Rhode Island, Quonset Point. The orders they received were as strange as they were simple. Design a building that could travel the world. A structure light enough to ship on a freighter, strong enough to survive a typhoon, and simple enough for 6 men with wrenches to assemble in a single day. It sounded like fantasy. One of the older engineers, a man who had designed shipyards in the 1920s, leaned back in his chair and muttered, "You're asking for a miracle made of sheet metal." The officer across the table replied quietly, "Yes, and we need it before Christmas." Outside the windows, the bay wind howled. Inside, pencils began to scratch on paper. Arches, curves, ribs, shapes not usually seen in American architecture, began to fill the drafting sheets. One of the younger designers remembered an old British structure from the last war, something called a Nissen hut, a curved steel shelter that could be erected quickly in France. The idea was crude, but promising. The Americans decided to start there and make it better, wider, stronger, simpler. They didn't just want something that could stand. They wanted something that could be mass-produced by the thousands. In the workshops at Quonset Point, the first experiment took form. Corrugated steel sheets, each curved by hand over wooden frames, were bolted together into a semicircle. Plywood panels were fastened at each end. The smell of oil and salt air filled the hangar as the men tightened the last bolts. When they stepped back, the structure looked awkward. Half a barrel lying on its side. It gleamed dull silver under the coastal light. The officers watching weren't impressed. One of them chuckled. "It looks like a chicken coop for giants." Another shook his head. "If it holds, it'll do." They ordered a test that same afternoon. The wind on Rhode Island's coast is a cruel teacher. Gusts off Narragansett Bay slam against anything that isn't built to last. When the storm rolled in that night, the engineers stayed behind to watch. Rain lashed the steel shell, thunder cracked above it, and salt spray hissed across the windows. By morning, everything outside was drenched and littered with debris. Everything except the curved hut. It stood exactly where they had left it, water streaming down its sides, the interior bone dry. The oldest engineer ran his hand along the cool metal and whispered, almost to himself, "It'll do." The news traveled fast through the Navy's construction offices. By the next week, there were phone calls from Washington asking for blueprints. The new shelter needed a name. Someone suggested simply calling it the Quonset Hut, after the place where it was born. The name stuck like a brand. It sounded mechanical, efficient, American. The men who built it didn't know it yet, but they had just created one of the most iconic silhouettes of the 20th century. While the engineers refined the design, increasing the width, adjusting the curvature, improving the end walls, the rest of the world was collapsing into war. On December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor turned sketches into orders overnight. The United States now faced a global fight stretching across oceans and climates it barely understood. Every hour mattered. Every piece of steel counted. The Quonset Hut was no longer an experiment. It was a necessity. Factories were drafted as quickly as soldiers. The George A. Fuller Company, already famous for building skyscrapers, turned its industrial muscles toward this new challenge. Workers who had once assembled office towers in New York now stamped corrugated panels for huts that would stand in jungles halfway across the world. Women in overalls, their hair wrapped in scarves, learned to rivet steel ribs under the glow of factory lights. Sparks flew like fireflies in the night. Every clang of a hammer echoed with urgency. In Washington, procurement officers worked without sleep. The goal wasn't to build hundreds of huts. It was to build tens of thousands. They needed to house engineers, nurses, radio operators, mechanics, and infantry. A global army was forming, and each man needed a place to rest his head. Ships leaving American ports began to carry more than ammunition and food. Deep in their holds lay crates stenciled Quonset Hut Kit Number. One each crate was a self-contained miracle. Every screw, every washer, every beam labeled and packed. The manual inside explained how to raise it with nothing more than manpower and a handful of tools. By early 1942, the first kits reached Hawaii, where Navy Seabees, the newly formed construction battalions, tested the design under real conditions. The results were better than anyone expected. A team of 8 men could build a 20-foot-wide hut in under 8 hours. Once they knew the rhythm, they could assemble 4 in a single day. It became a kind of choreography. Lay the foundation, bolt the base plates, lift the ribs, attach the sheets, seal the ends. By sunset, what had been an empty patch of mud became a home. Soldiers began to compete for time records. The huts weren't glamorous, but they were solid. When the next tropical storm hit Oahu, the tents flattened like paper. The huts didn't move. For the first time since the war began, men slept dry. They woke up in the morning without coughing up water from their lungs. They could shave in mirrors that weren't fogged with rain. They could write letters home on dry paper. The Quonset Hut had done something no general could accomplish. It had given soldiers comfort. Word spread through the ranks like legend. A Marine landing on Guadalcanal in August 1942 described the site as a miracle of tin. Where jungle had been, rows of curved roofs now glinted under the sun, forming a base that looked permanent even though it hadn't existed a week earlier. Pilots called them steel igloos. Mechanics nicknamed them half-moon hotels. The shape was strange, but soon it became familiar, the outline of safety. Meanwhile, production back home surged into overdrive. Every new order pushed the boundaries of scale. The Navy wanted huts wide enough to serve as mess halls. The Army wanted versions tall enough to store vehicles, and the hospitals requested double-length models for surgery wards. Engineers adapted on the fly. The beauty of the Quonset design was its flexibility. Need more space? Add another section. Need a door large enough for a truck? Cut the end panel and reinforce it with steel bands. It wasn't architecture. It was adaptability made visible. Factories learned to stamp out enough curved sheets for 300 huts a day. Train cars clattered across the country carrying nothing but steel ribs and bolts. The language of war production changed. Tanks rolled off lines. Planes took flight. And somewhere in between, the humble hut kept appearing, multiplying like cells across the map. When a general asked how long it would take to build a new base in the Pacific, a logistics officer replied with quiet confidence, However long it takes the ship to arrive, the buildings are already built. Every new theater of war revealed another strength of the design. In North Africa, where the sun could melt rubber soles, the reflective steel-curved roofs bounced heat away, keeping interiors cooler than canvas tents. In Alaska, where blizzards buried vehicles, the arch shape shrugged off snow like a seal sheds water. On small Pacific islands, the huts became command centers, hospitals, even chapels where weary soldiers knelt under the same ribs that sheltered mechanics and medics. Each use added another layer of myth. By 1943, the Quonset Hut had become as much a part of the American war identity as the Jeep or the Liberty ship. Newsreels back home showed footage of Seabees raising them like magic. Reporters marveled at the idea that a single ship could carry an entire village in crates. The public never saw the mud or the exhaustion. They saw efficiency, ingenuity, and hope. The truth was grittier. Life inside a hut wasn't paradise. The metal walls magnified noise, turned cold in the night and boiling hot by noon. Rain hammered the roof like artillery. But compared to what came before, it was heaven. One corporal wrote in his diary, "I can hear the storm outside, but the floor is dry and the roof doesn't move. That's good enough for me." In those words lies the heart of Section 1, the moment when America realized that survival was an equation solved not by heroics, but by design. The Quonset Hut was the answer to a question no one had asked before. How do you make a home that fits in a box and can follow a war? It was an invention born not out of glory but of need, hammered into being by ordinary people who would never see the battlefront. By the end of 1942, as convoys left ports for North Africa and the Pacific, the curved silhouette had already become a quiet symbol of something larger. The idea that America could build anything, anywhere, faster than anyone else. The huts didn't carry guns, but they carried endurance. They didn't roar like engines, but they hummed with faith. And somewhere in the dark factory nights of Rhode Island, a worker wiping sweat from her forehead might have smiled at the thought that the sheet of steel she just stamped would soon become a soldier's first dry night in months. When dawn broke over the war's endless horizons, the huts glimmered like small pieces of civilization planted in chaos. They stood for everything the enemy underestimated. The quiet, stubborn ingenuity that doesn't make headlines but wins wars all the same. The world needed a roof. America built one out of steel and sent it wherever men fought to stay human. Before the world saw the Quonset Hut as a symbol of strength, it was just an idea born out of frustration and sleepless nights. Inside a cold drafting room at Quonset Point, the smell of ink and steel hung in the air like war waiting to happen. The engineers were tired men, most of them civilians pressed into a race they hadn't signed up for. Every day the radio brought worse news. Ships sunk in the Atlantic, cities bombed in Europe, another island lost in the Pacific. And in between those grim headlines came telegrams from Navy bases begging for help. Need 300 shelters immediately. Tents destroyed in storm. Request durable portable housing. Each new message carried the same tone of quiet desperation. The generals could strategize about fronts and divisions, but these men had to solve a different kind of problem: how to keep a soldier alive between battles. The first prototype had already proven that the curved shape could stand against wind and rain, but the Navy wanted more. They wanted a shelter that could be mass-produced in thousands without specialized labor, one that used as little material as possible, one that could be packed into a single crate and rebuilt anywhere from a coral island to a frozen tundra. In short, they wanted the impossible. The design team, a handful of architects from the George A. Fuller Company, began to live inside their own drawings. They slept on cots between rolls of blueprint paper, ate sandwiches over half-finished sketches, and measured success in inches. Every curve, every bolt mattered. If the radius was too wide, the hut would collapse under snow. Too narrow, and the air inside would suffocate in the heat. They tested, adjusted, tested again. Each failure brought them closer to something simple enough to survive the complexity of war. There was no glamour in their work. Outside the hangar windows, Rhode Island's coastline looked calm and gray, but inside, the hammering never stopped. Sparks bounced off the floor as welders shaped the first steel ribs. These ribs, long arcs of corrugated metal, were the heart of the design. The engineers discovered that if they overlapped each sheet by just an inch and a half, the structure gained double the strength without adding weight. They didn't have computers, only rulers and instinct. When a test panel buckled under wind pressure, they marked the dent, took notes, and tried again. The result was a strange kind of perfection. Not elegant, not pretty, but undeniably strong. The hut could take punishment like a prize fighter and stay standing. The semicircular form became more than an engineering choice. It became philosophy. A straight wall resists force. A curve absorbs it. That's why bridges and domes endure while boxes crumble. The men at Quonset Point didn't quote geometry textbooks, but they understood instinctively what the Romans and cathedrals had learned centuries before. Strength lies in the arch. What they built was a modern cathedral for war, made not of stone but of rolled steel. The first complete model, 16 feet wide, 36 feet long, stood on a wooden platform behind the workshop. It looked small, almost toy-like. When the admiral overseeing the project arrived to inspect it, he walked a slow circle around the structure, tapping the ribs with his gloved hand. "You're telling me this will survive a typhoon?" he asked. One of the engineers, his voice hoarse from days without sleep, simply said, "Sir, it already has." The admiral smiled thinly and nodded. "Then build me 100. That was all the approval they needed. Within weeks, the Navy increased the order to thousands. The factory floor transformed overnight into an assembly line of organized chaos. Piles of corrugated steel sheets stretched higher than a man's shoulders. Workers moved like clockwork, cutting, stamping, drilling. The sound was deafening. The clang of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, the rhythmic thud of presses shaping steel into arcs. The men joked that the huts were being born screaming. Yet there was pride in that noise. Every spark was a spark of survival. Every finished rib a future home for soldiers they would never meet. The first shipments went to Pearl Harbor in early 1942. The harbor was still scarred from the December attack, ships half sunk in the water, oil still slicking the waves. When the crates arrived, the Seabees opened them with the curiosity of children unwrapping a new invention. Inside, everything was labeled and precise. Pre-drilled panels, bolts sorted by size, a simple instruction booklet that began with the words, 4. Men can build one hut in 8 hours. Skeptical, the sailors set to work. By sunset, under the light of oil lamps, they stepped back to see a perfect silver arc gleaming against the twilight. One man whistled. Another said, "Hell, it's faster than pitching a tent." They slept inside that night, the sound of wind replaced by the quiet ping of rain on steel. For the first time since the attack, some of them actually slept through the night. Word spread like wildfire. Commanders wrote to Washington demanding more. The huts began appearing at every major base: Samoa, Midway, the Philippines. Engineers modified the designs in the field. They added ventilation for the tropics, insulation for the cold, larger doors for jeeps, longer lengths for hospitals. Each modification became part of the official blueprint. The evolution of the Quonset Hut wasn't dictated from offices in Washington. It was written by the hands of men in muddy boots halfway around the world. Factories back home had to keep up. Production quotas doubled, then tripled. The Fuller Company could no longer handle the load alone, so new plants were built across the country. In New Jersey, New York, Illinois, and California, workers turned out steel arches by the thousands. To speed things up, the engineers simplified the design even further. The 16-foot model gave way to a 20-foot version, then a 40-foot one. They learned that by standardizing parts, making every bolt, panel, and rib interchangeable. They could reduce errors and maximize output. It was the same philosophy that made Ford cars and Liberty ships. Repetition as revolution. For every glamorous invention of the war, radar, the atomic bomb, the Mustang fighter, there were a dozen quiet miracles like this that made victory possible. The Quonset Hut became one of those unsung weapons. It didn't explode, it didn't shoot, but it saved lives by the thousands. Logistics officers began referring to it in reports as essential equipment. Without it, bases couldn't function, troops couldn't stay healthy, and operations stalled. The curved walls of corrugated steel became as vital as fuel and ammunition. By mid-1943, the demand was staggering. The U.S. Navy alone ordered over 25,000 units in 1 year. The Army followed suit. The Army Air Forces used them as maintenance hangars. Hospitals requested them for field wards. Engineers turned them into offices and machine shops. Even chaplains requisitioned huts to use as makeshift churches. Wherever the American flag landed, the half-moon silhouettes soon followed. From North Africa's deserts to Alaska's frozen harbors, the same silver arcs appeared on the horizon. Soldiers joked that they were like mushrooms after rain, everywhere, growing overnight. Inside the design rooms, the engineers kept innovating. They tested alternate materials, experimented with faster assembly methods, and wrote new manuals. They discovered that a crew of trained builders could assemble a hut in under 5 hours. They trained the CBs to build them in formation, like soldiers drilling with wrenches. One team would lay the foundation while another lifted the ribs, another bolted panels, and another sealed the ends. The process looked almost choreographed. An industrial ballet danced to the rhythm of hammers. The simplicity of the design was its genius. Every component could be replaced, repaired, or reused. The huts could be expanded by connecting multiple units end to end, forming long corridors or vast halls. A cluster of huts could become a headquarters, a hospital, or a barracks for 200 men. For the first time in military history, entire bases could be shipped in boxes. The human element behind it all often went unnoticed. In the Fuller factories, many workers were women, mothers, sisters, wives of men fighting overseas. They stood beside heavy machines, their hands blackened by oil, their eyes tired but determined. They knew the huts they were building weren't glamorous. They wouldn't appear on magazine covers or newsreels. But they also knew that somewhere, some soldier would thank God for a dry floor and a warm stove. One woman named Clara, a riveter from Jersey City, wrote in her diary, "Every time I bolt a panel, I think maybe my brother will sleep under it someday." That quiet connection stretched across oceans, steel carrying the touch of home. When the first mass shipments reached the Pacific Islands, the transformation was immediate. A barren beach one day, a functioning base the next. Airfields, kitchens, radio rooms, and hospitals all rose out of the same boxes. The huts gave structure to chaos. They turned raw, hostile environments into organized hubs of survival. War correspondents began to notice. One wrote in 1943, "The Americans fight not only with machines, but with buildings that grow overnight." In Alaska, engineers tested the huts against blizzards that could tear roofs off conventional buildings. They survived with minor dents. In the South Pacific, where humidity rusted everything, the huts held firm with minimal maintenance. They were virtually indestructible. The only real enemy was rust. And even that, soldiers learned to tame with a coat of paint and regular cleaning. By late 1943, the huts had become part of the visual language of the war. Photographs from every front showed the same curved roofs behind soldiers grinning at the camera. War artists painted them in the background of battle scenes. Journalists called them the tin tents that followed victory. The men who lived inside called them home. It's strange to think that a shape so simple could hold so much meaning. That half-circle of steel was more than architecture. It was a symbol of what America could do when it needed to move fast and think smart. It represented a nation's shift from comfort to necessity, from luxury to logic. And behind every bolt was a story of the workers who made it, the engineers who designed it, and the soldiers who found comfort beneath it. When historians later looked back, they called it a revolution in military logistics. But for the men who built it, it was just a problem solved under pressure. They didn't talk about legacy or innovation. They talked about deadlines, measurements, and fatigue. Yet unknowingly, they had created something timeless. The steel shell born on that gray Rhode Island coast was more than a product of war. It was proof that simplicity could be genius, that necessity could inspire beauty. Long after the blueprints were filed away and the factories fell silent, the curved silhouette would remain etched into memory. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest hour, someone somewhere was still building something meant to keep people alive. The birth of the Quonset Hut wasn't a single moment of triumph. It was a slow, grinding process. The sound of wrenches, the smell of hot steel, the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. It was proof that the war could be fought not just with courage, but with craftsmanship. And in that quiet triumph, amid the thunder of a world tearing itself apart, America discovered the strength of its own hands. By 1943, the war had become a machine, and inside that machine, America's factories were its beating heart. Across the country, furnaces glowed red through the night, the air thick with the smell of hot steel and oil. Trains rumbled out of cities hauling tanks, jeeps, guns, and now, something humbler but no less important, curved steel shells destined to become homes on the far edges of the world. The Quonset Hut, once a modest experiment from Rhode Island, was no longer just an invention. It had become an empire of steel, an industrial miracle mass-produced at a speed the world had never seen before. The numbers tell one story, but the feeling of it, the noise, the pressure, the unbroken rhythm, tells another. Imagine standing inside one of those factories at midnight. Sparks rain down from overhead cranes as workers feed corrugated steel sheets into presses that scream like jet engines. The machines stamp the same arc again and again, everyone identical to the last, each destined to fit perfectly into the next. It was a rhythm of survival, a kind of industrial heartbeat that echoed all the way from the Great Lakes to the Pacific coast. In the Midwest, where the automobile industry had once ruled, car plants now rolled out Hut components instead of Buicks. Ford's River Rouge plant, a monument to American mass production, quietly added Quonset panels to its assembly lines alongside airplane parts. In Cleveland, women in bandanas and grease-stained overalls packed bolts and washers into wooden crates, each labeled with stencils that read QH Portable Building. They didn't know where those crates would go. Some would end up in tropical jungles, others on wind-blasted cliffs in Alaska. But every worker knew what they were building wasn't just metal. It was protection. A roof against chaos. The line never stopped, not for Sundays, not for holidays. The war didn't pause, so neither could they. The result was staggering. By 1944, more than 500 factories across the United States were contributing parts or labor to the Quonset program. Corrugated steel came from mills in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Bolts and fittings were cast in Chicago. Wooden end panels were cut from Oregon pine and shipped east by rail. Somewhere in Rhode Island, the Fuller Company's headquarters coordinated it all with the precision of an orchestra conductor. Each trainload of parts became another verse in a song of industrial unity. Hundreds of thousands of men and women, none of them soldiers, but all of them fighting the same war with hammers and sweat. From the outside, the numbers looked almost impossible. More than 100,000 huts built in less than 4 years. But the secret wasn't superhuman speed. It was simplicity. The design had been refined to perfection. No wasted material, no unnecessary detail. A hut could be broken down into fewer than 200 components, all of them interchangeable. That meant any factory could produce parts without waiting for custom plans. Standardization became a weapon. The same logic that built rifles and Liberty ships now built homes for the men who used them. And then came the ships. Liberty freighters left American ports stacked high with crates marked for places few Americans could find on a map. Tarawa, Guadalcanal, Kwajalein, Saipan, Sicily, Iceland. Each crate contained a miracle of organization, a complete building flattened into wood and steel. The manifest might read, huts, 48 units. But what that really meant was that 48 families' worth of shelter were about to land on a beach that had never known comfort. When the first cargo ships reached the South Pacific, cranes swung the crates onto muddy beaches, where teams of engineers tore them open like Christmas presents. Within hours, the familiar half-moon shapes began to rise. Picture that moment. A stretch of raw jungle. The smell of salt, mud, and smoke. The buzz of insects thick in the air. Then the clang of hammers and the low hum of men working in rhythm. One after another, the steel ribs rise, glinting in the sunlight like the bones of some great mechanical creature. Plywood ends slam into place, bolts twist tight, and before dusk the first huts stand ready. Inside, soldiers spread out their gear, hang up wet uniforms, and sit down on dry floors for the first time in weeks. Some light cigarettes and stare at the curved ceiling, listening to the tropical rain drum overhead. It's not home, but it feels close. In the Pacific, these huts became lifelines. They were built on coral, in mud, on the sides of mountains. They became hospitals where surgeons worked through nights thick with humidity and fear. They became radio stations that connected entire fleets. They became chapels where voices sang hymns that echoed softly against steel. In a single day, a patch of jungle could transform from chaos to a functioning base. And when the military moved on, the huts stayed behind. Silent, durable ghosts that refused to vanish. Meanwhile, in Europe, the same transformation unfolded in the opposite direction. After the D-Day landings in June 1944, Allied forces needed infrastructure as urgently as ammunition. Normandy's fields and hedgerows turned into hubs of logistics overnight. The curved roofs appeared again, rows of them stretching across farmland, serving as command posts, medical wards, supply depots. Under their arches, decisions were made that shaped the fate of the continent. When snow fell during the winter of 1944, the huts held strong. Soldiers warmed their hands by stoves that rattled and hummed in the night. The curved walls groaned under the wind but didn't fail. In those frozen nights of the Battle of the Bulge, a dry roof and 4 steel walls meant the difference between life and death. The speed of it all bordered on the miraculous. A CB unit could land on a beach and, by sunset, build enough huts to shelter an entire regiment. Photographs from the time show construction crews smiling in the mud, sleeves rolled up, the silver arcs of the huts rising behind them like a field of moons. The camera never captured the exhaustion or the sweat, but the pride in those faces says everything. They were builders in a world of destroyers, and that meant something. By 1945, the Quonset Hut had become a universal sign of the American presence. Civilians across Europe and the Pacific recognized the shape instantly. To see that half circle on the horizon meant order, safety, medicine, food, the promise that the war was turning. The huts were as much a part of the American advance as the Sherman tank or the P-51 Mustang. And unlike tanks or planes, they didn't leave destruction behind. They left shelter. The scale of production kept breaking its own records. The Fuller Company built 25,000 huts in 1942, 35,000 in 1943, and over 50,000 in 1944. It wasn't just about the numbers. It was about coordination. Each hut kit required nearly 5 tons of materials. That's more than 500,000 tons of steel and wood shipped across the world in less than 4 years. Trains moved day and night. Ships crossed oceans. Cranes worked under blackout conditions. The American war machine had achieved something astonishing. It had turned architecture into logistics. Back home, posters and newsreels started showing the huts as symbols of ingenuity. "The home that goes to war," one headline read. Another called them steel tents for freedom. The irony was that the people building them never saw those headlines. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were just doing a job. But in the quiet moments, when a worker wiped sweat from her forehead and watched another batch of panels roll out of the press, she might have thought about the men sleeping under them. And that was enough. What made the Quonset Hut truly revolutionary wasn't its design or its quantity. It was its philosophy. It embodied the American idea that the best solutions are the simplest ones, that innovation doesn't always need elegance. The hut didn't try to look impressive. It tried to work, and it worked everywhere. Soldiers joked that if you dropped a Quonset hut on Mars, it would probably still stand. By the end of the war, Quonset huts dotted every continent except Antarctica. They stood in the Philippines, in India, in Egypt, in Italy. Some were used as theaters where troops watched newsreels from home. Others served as schools for local children after liberation. They became warehouses, kitchens, offices, repair shops, even jailhouses. In one base on Guam, engineers connected dozens of huts into a long curved tunnel system that survived 2 typhoons without a single breach. The design had transcended its purpose. It wasn't just a building. It was a mindset. And in a way, it became a quiet kind of poetry. Picture a soldier standing outside his hut at dusk, somewhere on an island whose name he'll forget. The sky burns orange, the air heavy with salt and diesel fumes. Behind him, the curved roofs stretch across the landscape like a field of silver shells. He knows he'll move on soon. Another battle, another island. But for this moment, he's safe. The steel above him hums softly as it cools from the day's heat. He lights a cigarette, leans against the arch, and watches the horizon. Somewhere far away in a factory in Ohio, someone's mother is stamping another piece of that same steel. Neither will ever know each other, but they are connected. One by survival, the other by creation. That is how wars are truly fought and won. When victory finally came into view in 1945, the huts had already done their work. They had given America something no bomb or bullet ever could: endurance. They were the quiet backbone of the war, the proof that organization and adaptability could conquer chaos. Soldiers who had lived in them for years spoke of them with affection. "They kept us dry," one Marine said simply, "and that's all you can ask for when the world's on fire." As the war machine began to slow, factories shut down, and the noise faded. The assembly lines that had run without pause for 4 years went silent one by one. Workers took off their gloves and went home. The war had consumed everything: steel, sweat, time. And left behind millions of curved ribs, thousands of crates, and a shape that would outlive its purpose. Across the world, the huts stood like metal fossils of an age of production, testaments to the idea that civilization could be rebuilt faster than it could be destroyed. The industrial flood that had built them was more than a story of efficiency. It was a story of faith. Faith in labor, in intelligence, in the human to turn need into invention. The Quonset Hut was proof that when the world demanded miracles, ordinary people could deliver them by the thousands, one bolt at a time. The first thing a man noticed when he stepped inside a Quonset hut wasn't the steel or the bolts. It was the sound. The rain didn't just fall on the roof. It drummed, it sang, it became a rhythm that filled the space like a heartbeat. On calm nights, you could hear the ocean outside, or the wind curling around the edges of the curved walls, whispering like a voice trying to get in. For soldiers used to tents that tore in storms or foxholes that flooded overnight, the sound of rain on steel wasn't noise. It was safety. It meant the roof was holding. It meant they could sleep without fear of waking up underwater. Inside, the air always smelled the same: a mix of oil, sweat, damp canvas, and metal polish. The floorboards creaked under heavy boots, and every sound echoed softly, bending with the curve of the walls. A Quonset hut had no corners, no shadows to hide in. Everything felt exposed, honest. In the dim light of lanterns, the steel ribs looked like the inside of a giant whale, enclosing the men in its belly, carrying them through the storms of war. 12, sometimes 20 men shared a single hut. Their cots lined both sides, a narrow aisle between them filled with gear, rifles, and muddy boots. Against the back wall, someone always built a small shelf from leftover planks, a place for letters, photographs, and shaving kits. On some bases, the huts had stoves in the center, little iron boxes that rattled when fed with coal or diesel. In the tropics, the stoves stayed cold and useless, but in the frozen outposts of Alaska or Northern Europe, that stove was a lifeline. Men huddled around it with tin cups of coffee, trading jokes that hid the exhaustion in their eyes. Every hut developed its own personality. Some were loud, full of laughter and card games. Others were quiet, heavy with the kind of silence that only war can create. A silence made of waiting. When mail arrived, men tore open envelopes with trembling hands, reading words that smelled faintly of home. The letters were pinned to the curved walls with nails, fluttering in the breeze from a half-open vent. Above one cot, a photograph of a wife and child would hang. Above another, a pin-up girl from a magazine, smiling at a man who might never see her again. There was no privacy. You dressed, slept, and dreamed inches from other men. Arguments flared and faded quickly. Friendships were born from shared misery. Two men splitting a can of beans under a leaking roof became brothers for life. The Quonset hut didn't care about rank or background. Inside those walls, everyone was equal. Equally wet, equally cold, equally tired. When storms came, the huts became theaters of sound. Rain pounded so hard it drowned conversation. Lightning flashed through small windows, lighting up faces lined with fatigue. Sometimes in the middle of the night, a man would wake up thinking artillery had started again, only to realize it was just another Pacific monsoon beating down. The curved roof turned weather into music, and soldiers learned to sleep by its rhythm. In a strange way, it became comforting. The proof that even when nature raged, something man-made could endure. But the huts weren't just for sleeping. They were entire worlds in miniature. Some became mess halls where men stood in long lines, tin trays in hand, waiting for watery soup and hard bread. The smell of food mixed with diesel fumes and sweat, filling the air until it was almost too thick to breathe. Others became field hospitals, where medics and nurses moved under the same curved ceilings, their faces pale in the harsh light of hanging bulbs. The steel walls echoed with the sounds of clinking instruments, whispered prayers, and the groans of the wounded. Blood was scrubbed off the floors with seawater and rags. The same walls that sheltered laughter one day absorbed agony the next. There were chapels, too. Makeshift sanctuaries built from the same kits. Wooden crosses nailed to the ends, hymn sheets pinned to the walls. Soldiers sat on crates instead of pews, helmets in their laps, heads bowed. The sound of rain outside became part of the hymn. "Onward, Christian soldiers," someone would sing, voice trembling, echoing through the ribs of the hut like a promise. For a few minutes, even in the middle of war, there was peace. In the evenings, when duties ended, the huts came alive with a different kind of noise. Someone played harmonica. Someone else told stories about the farm he'd left behind. Cigarette smoke curled under the lamps. The laughter came easily, almost defiantly, as if mocking the darkness outside. A sergeant might walk in, shout about discipline, then quietly pour himself a cup of coffee and join the game. In the tropics, men stripped to undershirts and sweated through their nights. In colder climates, they slept in full uniform, boots and all. The huts adapted, just like the men. And always, there was the smell, the faint metallic tang that clung to everything. Even years later, veterans could recall it instantly. "You never forget that smell," one old Marine said decades after the war. "Steel, salt, sweat. You smell it and you're back there, 20 years old, scared, and pretending not to be." The huts changed men in small ways. They gave them routines. You woke, folded your blanket, cleaned your rifle, and stepped outside into the mud. You came back 12 hours later, hung your helmet on a nail, and lay down under the same steel arch that had held through another day. The repetition became comfort. The war outside was unpredictable, but the hut was steady. It didn't move. It didn't complain. It just existed. Silent, faithful, indestructible. Sometimes in the quiet before dawn, a man would sit on his bunk and listen to the world breathing. The rain would slow to a drizzle, the stove would tick as it cooled, and in that fragile calm, he'd think of home. He'd picture the house he'd left. Wooden floors, soft beds, corners that didn't echo. But even then, he'd look around at the curved steel walls and feel something close to gratitude. The hut wasn't beautiful, but it was enough. It was proof that someone back home cared enough to give him this. There were days when the huts themselves became characters in the war, silent witnesses to history. On the beaches of Normandy, they stood behind the front lines as command centers where officers traced battle maps across folding tables. In the Pacific, they became repair shops where mechanics crawled under Jeep engines and cursed in 3 languages. On tiny islands with names no one remembers, they became schools for local children after the fighting ended. The same walls that once held soldiers now echoed with laughter and chalk dust. Every hut had scars, bullet holes patched with tin, names carved into beams, rust blooming like bruises. But they kept standing. In Okinawa, a typhoon ripped apart an entire camp, flattening tents and overturning trucks. When the storm cleared, only the huts were left. Bent, battered, but upright. The men who crawled out of the wreckage looked at those curved roofs and shook their heads. "Guess she's tougher than we are," one said, patting the steel. Inside, soldiers turned the huts into pieces of themselves. They painted murals on the walls, pin-up girls, hometown skylines, baseball teams. They hung Christmas decorations made from scrap wire and ration tins. In some huts, they kept mascots, dogs, monkeys, even parrots picked up from local villages. The animals slept under bunks, shared food, and barked when shells fell too close. For a while, those huts weren't just shelters. They were worlds, fragile pockets of normalcy inside madness. Letters from home spoke of houses and jobs waiting after the war, but many soldiers quietly wondered if they could ever go back. They had lived too long under steel arches, too long in places where survival meant simplicity. The hut had taught them something about life, that comfort didn't need luxury, that strength could be curved, that hope could fit into a crate. When the war ended and orders came to pack up, many men found it strangely difficult to leave their huts. They stood outside, hands on the metal walls, looking at the dents and rust marks as if saying goodbye to an old friend. Some took pieces, a bolt, a scrap of panel, a bit of flooring, to keep as souvenirs. For years afterward, those small pieces sat on mantels and desks, reminders of the place where they learned endurance. To outsiders, a Quonset hut was just a structure. Cheap, mass-produced, replaceable. But to the men who lived in them, it was something more intimate. It had kept them dry when nothing else could. It had given them a sense of boundary in a world without control. It had been the only constant in a war that tore everything else apart. Even decades later, when veterans gathered for reunions, the stories always circled back to the huts. Not the battles, not the medals, the huts. The sound of rain on steel, the smell of oil and damp socks, the laughter echoing against curved walls. It wasn't nostalgia for comfort, there had been none, but for the strange unity that those huts created. They were the great equalizers of war. Generals and privates alike slept under the same roofs, ate in the same mess halls, prayed in the same chapels. The curve didn't care who you were. It only cared that you needed shelter. Inside a Quonset hut, war felt both distant and close. Distant because the steel shielded you from the chaos outside. Close because you could still hear the world breathing through the thin walls. Artillery thuds miles away, waves crashing against shorelines, the faint cries of the wounded carried by the wind. Those sounds mixed with the rhythm of hammers, stoves, and footsteps, creating a strange symphony that no one who lived it ever forgot. When the lights went out at night, and the only illumination came from a lantern swinging gently on its hook, shadows curved perfectly along the walls, wrapping the men in darkness that felt almost protective. Someone would murmur a prayer, another would turn over and mumble in his sleep. Outside, the war raged on. But inside, under that arch of steel, time paused. It was just another night under the half moon. Another night survived. And maybe that was the real miracle of the Quonset hut. It didn't promise luxury or beauty. It promised endurance. It took chaos and gave it form. It turned mud into shelter and fear into routine. It reminded men that even in the middle of hell, they could still build something that worked, something that lasted. Years later, when some of those same huts were converted into classrooms or diners back home, veterans would walk in, stop mid-step, and look up. They'd recognize the curve instantly. They'd close their eyes and for a moment hear rain again, smell diesel and coffee, feel the ghost of comrades long gone. And they'd smile. A small, private smile that said everything words couldn't. The steel remembered. So did they. When the war finally ended in 1945, the silence felt heavier than the noise that had filled the years before. The machines stopped, the furnaces cooled, and across the oceans the sound of hammers faded into the memory of victory. The soldiers came home, the factories emptied, and for the first time in 4 years, the world exhaled. But scattered across continents, under different skies and climates, stood thousands of curved steel shells, quiet, enduring, and somehow more alive than ever. The war had built them for destruction's shadow, but peace had other plans. In the beginning, no one quite knew what to do with them. The military had ordered over 100,000 Quonset huts, and now the war that had justified their existence was over. Some officers suggested scrapping them for steel, melting them down into peacetime tools. Others argued to keep them in place as storage for the post-war occupation. But there were too many, spread too far. From the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Philippines, from Iceland to New Guinea, they stood like monuments to function, durable, cheap, and unyielding. Even the elements had failed to kill them. The steel had rusted in places, yes, but the bones of those huts, their ribs, were still strong. And back home, America was facing its own crisis. Millions of men returned from war to a country unprepared to house them. Cities overflowed. Colleges, flooded with veterans under the new WWII bill, ran out of dorms before classes began. Suburbs didn't yet exist in the form we know today. The nation that had built shelters for armies now needed shelters for peace. And so, almost without plan or permission, the Quonset hut found a second life. The government began selling surplus huts for as little as $1,000 apiece, a fraction of what it had cost to make them. Farmers bought them first. On wide-open plains, those same curved steel shells that had sheltered soldiers now stored tractors and grain. They looked strange at first, half-moons scattered across fields of wheat. But they worked. They kept out rain, withstood wind, and lasted through winters. Mechanics turned them into workshops. Small-town merchants converted them into garages and warehouses. They were practical, affordable, and indestructible. Qualities that America, exhausted and rebuilding, desperately needed. Then came the colleges. Universities from Michigan to UCLA, from Brown to Minnesota, scrambled to house the tidal wave of returning veterans and their families. The answer came in crates stamped QH. In a matter of months, Quonset villages appeared on campuses across the country. Long rows of huts lined with wooden porches and laundry lines. Inside, families made homes out of steel and plywood. Kitchens were improvised from oil drums and gas stoves. Children played in the narrow aisles that once held bunks for soldiers. The sound of typewriters and laughter replaced the roar of engines. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something close to hope. In Ann Arbor, students at the University of Michigan called their hut neighborhood Veterans Village. At night, the curved ceilings glowed with warm yellow light. You could hear radios playing swing music through the thin walls, babies crying, couples whispering about the future. Outside, snow piled up against the rounded roofs, but inside there was warmth, the kind that only comes from people who've seen too much and survived it together. One veteran wrote home to his parents, "It's not much to look at, but it feels right. The roof curves like the sky we slept under in the Pacific. Only this time, no one's shooting at us." The huts spread beyond the campuses. They became diners with neon signs and checkered floors, churches where priests preached under corrugated ceilings, roller rinks, dance halls, repair shops, town halls. In small towns across America, you could walk down a street and spot one. That familiar half-moon, painted white or red, sitting quietly behind new post-war buildings. They were relics of war repurposed for peace, like helmets turned into flower pots. For many families, the huts were temporary homes that lasted far longer than intended. Couples married inside them, children were born inside them, and by the 1950s, some of those same huts had outlasted the cars parked next to them. Their owners patched rust with new sheet metal, added windows, painted them green or sky blue. They bent the harshness of war into the shape of domestic life. There was something poetic in it. The idea that the same steel which once stood against storms and bullets now sheltered laughter and love. But the huts didn't belong only to America anymore. In the ruins of Europe and the islands of the Pacific, they became part of the landscape of recovery. In Britain, they housed refugees and workers rebuilding bombed cities. In France, they became storage depots and schools. In the Philippines and Guam, they became homes, shops, and churches. Some were even turned into hospitals that continued to serve local communities long after American troops had gone home. Wherever they remained, they adapted. Quiet, unpretentious, and useful. Time, of course, left its marks. The steel faded, paint peeled, panels warped. Some huts collapsed from neglect, but others endured with a kind of stubborn grace. You can still find them today, on farms, behind warehouses, tucked into the corners of college campuses. Some stand alone in fields, their once silver skin rusted to a deep brown, like old armor left behind after a forgotten battle. Others have been restored, polished, and repurposed again for the modern world. Architects rediscovered their brilliance. Low cost, minimal materials, easy assembly. In an age chasing sustainability, the Quonset Hut suddenly felt decades ahead of its time. By the 1970s, they had taken on a new meaning. For some, they were nostalgic reminders of wartime unity. For others, they symbolized the industrial optimism of mid-century America, a time when every problem had a solution, and every solution could be built with steel and resolve. Artists and filmmakers began using them as visual shorthand for that era, a curve of memory against the skyline. In some photographs, they stand beside overgrown grass and forgotten airstrips, haunting but peaceful, their silence louder than words. Even now, 80 years after they were first stamped and bolted together, the Quonset Hut remains a presence. Some have been reborn as art studios, breweries, tiny homes, and community centers. Their curves cast familiar shadows, the same shape that once stretched across distant battlefields. When sunlight hits the corrugated steel just right, you can almost see history shimmering in the reflection. The ghost of soldiers, the hum of factories, the hope of builders. But beyond their physical survival lies something deeper. The Quonset hut became a metaphor for the American character, functional, adaptable, resilient. It wasn't elegant, but it never needed to be. It was honest. In a world that was broken, it gave form to the idea that strength could be simple and simplicity could last. For the men who once lived beneath those arches, returning to civilian life was its own kind of battle. They traded helmets for hats, rifles for briefcases, and yet a part of them always missed the rhythm of rain on steel. Decades later, some of them sought out the huts that had sheltered them. Old soldiers in their 70s would drive to abandoned airfields or old bases and stand in front of the rusting shells. They'd reach out, touch the cold metal, and for a moment they'd be young again. Hearing the laughter of their squad mates, smelling the smoke of stoves, seeing light flicker on curved walls. A few tears, maybe a soft chuckle. "Still standing, huh?" they'd whisper. And the steel, if it could speak, would have said, "So are you." That's the quiet truth of the Quonset hut's legacy. It wasn't designed to last forever, but it refused to die. It outlived empires, outlasted bases, survived storms, and became part of the civilian world it was never meant for. It proved that something built for war could carry peace forward, not through glory or grandeur, but through utility and endurance. When historians tell the story of World War II, they talk about the great machines, the tanks, the bombers, the ships that changed the tides of history. But somewhere beneath that noise lies this quiet shape, the humble half-moon that followed every victory, outlasted every campaign, and stood wherever human beings needed a roof. The Jeep gave them mobility, the Liberty ship gave them reach, but the Quonset hut gave them home. And maybe that's why even today, in forgotten corners of airfields or overgrown patches of farmland, these huts still stand. Rusted, yes. Weathered, absolutely. But unbroken. They were never meant to be monuments, yet they became exactly that. Monuments not to war, but to endurance, to design born from desperation, to the idea that shelter is as sacred as any weapon. If you ever find one, half buried in grass, its steel skin flaking in the sun, stop for a moment. Step closer. Run your hand along the ridges. Listen to the wind slide over its curve. You'll hear an echo, not of battle, but of the people who built it, lived in it, and never forgot it. The Quonset hut doesn't belong to history books. It belongs to memory, to the shared heartbeat of a generation that built a world from pieces and believed that even in ruin, something strong could still rise. In the end, that's its real story. Not about steel or architecture or logistics, but about human endurance. The hut that began as an emergency shelter became a symbol of what people can do when they have nothing but necessity and will. It reminds us that even temporary things can leave permanent marks, that a shape drawn in haste can outlast centuries, that sometimes survival itself is the most beautiful kind of design. The war gave birth to it, peace adopted it, and time, with all its cruelty, has yet to erase it. The half-moon still stands,